Thank you, Mr. Chair. The new sustainability regulations require European banks to report the ESG status of corporate customers. Companies will need to show that their lending practices support companies with good sustainability records. Furthermore, they'll need to prove that they're loosening ties with firms that are poor ESG performers. This is the type of social engineering our constituents are so concerned about happening here in this country. To Mr. Kupiec and Ms. Skinner, Treasury Secretary Yellen has said she opposes these regulations, but what can Congress do to ensure the Biden administration is actively pushing back on the EU and other regulators that push these policies?
Thank you for the question. So again, as I've testified, there is no political consensus that mirrors that which exists in the European Union around their Green Deal, which is to say there's no political consensus that the U.S. banking agencies should be channeling capital to green sectors, right? So the question on the table is not necessarily whether governments should do something about climate change, but whether they should require the banking sector to facilitate that goal. And because we don't have this shared political consensus, I agree with you that it's important Congress have the tools to be able to look under the hood to see if that is in fact the objective that is permeating some of the standards promulgated at the BCBS and the FSB. And so I think the steps proposed in the bill today take important measures in order to give Congress the ability to ask U.S. banking agencies how they are representing U.S. interests, what interests have featured in their bill, and to establish a system for regular reporting on the interests that factor into the negotiations.
Very good. Mr. Kupiec?
Yeah, I think of it a little differently, I think, than you. I think that it's a policy of this administration to promote green energy and to discourage brown energy, that the president signed an executive order to that effect, telling the FSOC to find climate change as a systemic risk and directing the agencies to promulgate rules and regulations to mitigate climate change systemic risk. And then they used the Basel Committee on Bank Supervision to craft principles that then they have to bring back home. So I view a chain here. So I think it's the intention of the executive branch to do this, and I do not think it's in the remit of regulatory agencies to. Climate change is not a current safety and soundness issue, and I don't think they should be regulating it. But the FSOC disagrees with me.
Well, I agree with you. I think that should matter. As we know, Dodd-Frank supplied the statutory basis for the 2013 Basel implementation rule. However, U.S. regulators seem to assume that Dodd-Frank continues to supply a statutory basis for implementing or fine-tuning Basel III 13 years later. So this raises a question on whether regulators are moving beyond U.S. law rather than simply acting in response to Basel commitments. To Ms. Skinner, did you believe this is consistent with recent Supreme Court precedent that limits the discretion of the executive branch?
No, I don't believe it's consistent with U.S. Supreme Court precedent, specifically in regard to the way that the rule was proposed initially last year. So with the original contours of the proposed rule, we'd be very likely to see significant changes in banking market structure, with lots of banking activity flowing to other parts of the financial system, a collapse of the three-tier model of banking, making it more arduous for small community banks to thrive. And so this kind of structural transformation of the economy would be something that Congress would have to have clearly instructed the banking agencies to do with a rule, and they wouldn't be able to just rely on an old 13-year-old statute for that authority.
So let me continue. Many of the priorities discussed in the Basel Task Force reflect the national priorities and, I guess, domestic law of various members, which are not necessarily consistent, right, with U.S. law and priorities. So there's really no transparency in these deliberations at all. So what would you tell a member of Congress? How can you separate out foreign interests from international agreements that are made by Basel participants?
As the process stands currently, I think it is very difficult for Congress to get this information, and you need better statutory tools to ask the U.S. banking agencies, the members who are representing the U.S. interests, and I have no doubt that many of them are acting in good faith, but many of them may have a different idea of what they'd like to see the U.S. pursuing. So if Congress has better tools, as the bill suggests, for asking and requiring evidence, cost-benefit analysis, some kind of justification for taking, whether it be an informal supervisory standard or a formal rule, some kind of justification for why that's a good fit for the U.S. economy and why the benefits are likely to outweigh the costs.
Gentleman's time
that
has
would certainly
expired.